Good morning. I would encourage you to open up to the book of Esther, or Esther, depending on how you would like to pronounce it. I always, for whatever reason, pronounce it Esther, and Melina always makes fun of me, much like I make fun of Melina, or I'm sorry, make fun of Nathan. Sorry, that was a joke that went sharply in a different direction. I was actually just about to say how much I appreciate what he said and how now I feel bad that I can't just get up here and make fun of him all the time like I'm used to doing, so I guess I'll have to find a new target. Luckily, there's one sitting 2 rows in front of him, so Wiley will be my new patsy every single time that I need to make fun of somebody. Esther chapter 1, though, if you would go ahead and open up to that. We're going to read the entire chapter 1. If you're familiar with the story of Esther, you know it well. You know that this is a story that is about a woman who is in, quite frankly, a really tough situation. She's in a situation that is almost unwinnable, not necessarily because of her, but because of her people. Mordecai is the kind of the hero, the unsung hero of this book. Mordecai is the one who finds out about a plot against the Jews. He goes towards Esther. Esther is able to intervene on the Jews' behalf towards Ahasuerus. And the entire Jewish race is saved, more or less, kind of in a roundabout way. But today what I want to talk about is not Esther. I don't want to discuss Esther at all, and that's not because I can't really pronounce her name. That's not why I don't want to discuss her. But it's because I want to focus on somebody else in this book. I want to focus in on the Queen Vashti from Esther chapter 1. I want you to read the first 9 verses with me as we kind of put this backstory. We're going to do some context, and then we're going to make some lessons from it. Esther chapter 1, starting in verse 1, it says, "Now it took place in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. In those days, as King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne, which was at the citadel in Susa, in the 3rd year of his reign." Just to kind of put this in historical context, we're looking right around the year 450 BC. And Ahasuerus is the king of the Persian Empire. He's probably one of, if not the most powerful human being in the known world at this point. This, by the way, would be the empire that eventually Alexander the Great would take over, which would kind of buttress his kingdom moving forward. But nevertheless, Ahasuerus is a gigantic, monumental figure in world history. And so this is not something that happens just kind of in this faraway corner of the universe. This is a really, really big deal. In verse 3, "The 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his princes in attendance, the army officers of Persia and Media, the nobles, the princes of his provinces being in his presence. And he displayed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor of his great majesty for many days, 180 days. And when these days were completed," verse 5, "the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days for all the people who were present at the citadel in Susa, from the greatest to the least in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were hangings of fine white and violet linen, held by cords of fine purple linen on silver rings and marble columns, couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels of various kinds, and the royal wine was plentiful according to the king's bounty, and the drinking was done according to the law." This, I think, is one of the most interesting facts about this, that the drinking was done according to the law. There was no compulsion, for so the king had given orders to each official of his household that he should do according to the desires of each person. That plays a huge role in this chapter, because what it tells you is that everything that happens here in Esther chapter 1 is completely 100% voluntary. Nobody was forced to do anything that they didn't feel comfortable doing. Verse 9, "Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the palace, which belonged to King Ahasuerus." There's a lot of contextual information that's cycling around here in Esther chapter 1, but I'll break it down for you real simply. Esther chapter 1, verses 1 through 9, what you have are 3 distinct banquets. You have one for Ahasuerus and kind of his nobles and his chiefs and his captains. You have one for Vashti and the women in the province, and then you have one for everybody. And so there's a lot of different banquets happening here, but if you read in verses 5 through 9, the one that the king is at is obviously the most opulent. This is the one where there's all sorts of gold. This is the one where there's couches. This is the one where the alcohol is flowing freely. This is the one where the food is very bountiful. That's the one that we're going to focus in here in Esther chapter 1. So you have 3 different banquets happening here in Esther chapter 1. When you start in verse 10, you have a little bit more of the description. This is where the story really begins to take place. Esther chapter 1, starting verse 10, it says, "On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine," because after all, the alcohol was flowing freely. Now you have 7 days down the road, "he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Bagatha, Zethar, and Carcass," which I practiced all of those names this week, "the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus. He commanded them to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and the princes, for she was beautiful. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. Then the king became very angry, and his wrath burned within him." This is atypical for a lot of reasons. In this. Esther chapter 1, verses 10 through 12. This scene is very atypical for a lot of reasons. Number one, you have by far probably the most beautiful woman in the province. As a matter of fact, Vashti literally means beautiful woman. But the fact that King Ahasuerus is going so far as to try and bring his queen in front of his nobles and his captains and his princes is not only unethical, but quite frankly, it's against the societal norms of that day. Somebody who would have occupied a position like Queen Vashti had would not have been degraded to such a point as becoming a sideshow for a bunch of drunken men at a banquet. Never mind the fact that all the other men were probably drunk by this point, several days into this at this point. Ethics was completely out the window, morals were completely out the window, but Vashti, verse 12, stood up to him. Now, we'll talk about this a little bit more here in a minute, but there's some debate as to whether or not Vashti was trying to keep her modesty in check or whether she was bucking against this trend. The idea that this was not the way that things were supposed to happen, and yet Ahasuerus was trying to do it anyways. We don't know what Queen Vashti's motivation was for here. But what we do know in this passage was that she absolutely, for so many reasons, made the right choice, even if it didn't seem like that at the point, or at the time. Look in verse 16 now. Go down a few verses. Verse 16, Esther chapter 1, starting in verse 16. It says, in the presence of the king and the princes, Memucan said, that's one of the eunuchs that had mentioned earlier. Memucan said, Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but also all the princes and all the peoples who are in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. And listen to this. This is the flashpoint reason. This is the core reason for everything that happens in this chapter. Verse 17, for the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, causing them to look with contempt on their husbands by saying, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought into his presence, but she did not come. Do you notice what's happening here? A lot of people argue when you look at Esther, when you look at Herod Antipas, which we're going to talk about here a little bit later, they look at the situation and they think the reason that Herod and Ahasuerus did what they did to Vashti and Herodias and all these other people is because they were embarrassed. And there's probably some embarrassment happening on King Ahasuerus' part that his queen didn't come and present herself before all of his drunken friends. There's probably some embarrassment happening there. But the biggest reason, according to verse 17, is people began to be worried. Because what's going to happen, according to verse 17, if women start standing up to their husbands? I am not going to make any more comments on that point right now because I prefer to sleep indoors. But I will tell you that's the flashpoint for this entire thing. Ahasuerus is looking at Vashti. He's looking at the situation in his magnificent empire. And he's saying, if the queen can stand up to me, then we might have ourselves a little mini full-blown revolt on our hands. Verse 18, this day the ladies of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's conduct will speak in the same way to all the king's princes, and there will be plenty of contempt and anger. If it pleases the king, verse 19, let a royal edict be issued by him and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media so that it cannot be repealed, that Vashti may no longer come into the presence of King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is more worthy than she. That's a gigantic deal as well. You do not depose a queen like Vashti willy-nilly, especially if the result of that marriage or the reason for that marriage in the first place was some kind of political alliance. You know, when you look throughout the Middle Ages, you get used to kings deposing queens literally however they want to. Henry VII or Henry VIII was the perfect example of that. He just deposes queens, he gets a new one, deposes her, gets a new one, deposes her. That didn't happen. And especially didn't happen when you're the leader of a world empire with 127 provinces. That signals to everybody that what Vashti did was a very, very, very big deal. And you can see how very real the threat was with these people, that they were worried about this little uprising that was going to take place. Verse 20, when the king's edict which he shall make is heard throughout all his kingdom, great as it is, then all women will give honor to her husbands, great and small. That's a roundabout way of demanding respect from your wife. Verse 21, this word pleased the king in the provinces, and the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province according to its script, to every people according to their language, that every man should be the master in his own house, and the one who speaks in the language of his people. Vashti is disposed here at the end of Esther chapter 1, verses 16 through 22, because the question comes up, what are we going to do with this insubordination? And you can't help, and I mentioned the story of Esther as it plays out throughout the rest of this book, you can't help but notice the irony in this situation. Because here Vashti is standing up to Ahasuerus, and everybody is beside themselves. What are we going to do if women, and I'm using this very connotatively and in the culture of the time, if women don't know their place in that culture, what are we going to do with them? That's the insubordination that they're worried about. And yet when you look at the story of Esther as it plays out over the next several chapters, Esther is able to influence her husband on a number of different levels, ultimately for the betterment of the Jewish people. And yet in Esther chapter 1, that was the main reason that they were scared about, is if women started standing up to their husbands. And yet later, that's exactly what Esther does, in a very subtle type of way. I love the story of Queen Vashti for so many reasons. I love what she represents. I love the fact that she stands up to the most powerful human being in the universe at that point. I hate the fact that she's deposed of it, but you can't help but learn so many lessons from whom this woman is. And I fear sometimes as we talk about these, not minor characters, because there's no less important characters in Scripture, but I worry sometimes as we read these stories about these massive human beings like Esther or Mordecai or Haman even, that we ignore people like Vashti. And yet Vashti, I argue to you, can be a fantastic source of strength and can be a fantastic example of modesty. What you see represented in Vashti as she displays modesty in her own life are three core lessons. Number one, when the world shows off, modesty covers up. I want you to look at 1 Timothy chapter 2. You knew if we were doing a lesson on modesty, we'd eventually get here. Look at 1 Timothy chapter 2. Look at 1 Timothy chapter 2, starting in verse 9. 1 Timothy chapter 2, starting in verse 9. Modesty is defined by a lot of ways or a lot of different things, many of which we'll get to throughout the course of this lesson, but most of it finds its genesis within these two verses. Look here in 1 Timothy chapter 2, starting in verse 9. I was wondering why 1 Timothy 1, verse 9 was not talking about modesty. It's chapter 2, verses 9. 1 Timothy chapter 2, starting verse 9. Likewise, I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing, modesty, and discreetly, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly garments, but rather by means of good works, as is proper for women making a claim to godliness. I understand full well that this context of modesty, as you continue here in 1 Timothy chapter 2, has to do with women's roles within the public worship. That's a completely separate topic that we do not have the time to get into right now, but I want you to focus in on verses 9 and 10, because verses 9 and 10 form the core for what he's eventually going to say there in verse 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. What he has here in verses 9 and 10 is what we call a not but issue, which is to say, I don't want you to do this, but I want you to do this. And the point is not so much to denigrate the not part as it is to accentuate the other part. I don't want you necessarily to focus on this. I want you to focus in on this part. And so read this section again. Read these two verses with that in mind. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. Likewise, I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing, modestly and discreetly, not with braided hair and gold and pearls or costly garments. In other words, I don't want that to be the focus of the attention. Verse 10, but I want you rather by means of good works, as is proper for women making a claim to godliness. What Paul is emphasizing there in 1 Timothy chapter 2, and in my opinion is not emphasized enough, is he has nothing to do in this passage with talking about what you wear. What you wear is a symptom of a much bigger issue. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 9 and 10, he says, I don't want your adornment, that which gives you glory. I don't want that to be merely braided hair, pearl, and gold and clothes. That's not what I want you to focus on. And I love the use of the word there in verse 9 as merely. Because clothes and braided hair and gold and pearls, those are just accentuations. What truly should matter, as we mentioned there in verse 10, is your conduct, is your heart, is the good works that adorn you. That's what we all, even especially women in this passage in 1 Timothy 2, but we should all be focused on. And so modesty, if you go back to Esther chapter 1, it's not about making yourself a sideshow for a bunch of drunken men. True beauty and true value is seen in your good works and your love and your charity and that which is the hidden person of the heart. That's what Paul is emphasizing here in 1 Timothy chapter 2. And sometimes we take tangents off of this and say, it matters what you wear, it matters what you don't wear. That's true. Because the idea of modesty, especially literally, is not that you wear too little, but that you wear too much. That I'm drawing attention to myself by what I put on or by what I don't put on. Those are symptoms of the issue. But the issue is that should not be where our focus should be. And I think every conversation surrounding modesty in any form needs to come back to that core central point. Peter dives into a little bit more of this in 1 Peter chapter 3. Flip over there if you would. 1 Peter chapter 3, starting in verse 1. 1 Peter chapter 3, starting in verse 1, very similar type of mentality. 1 Peter chapter 3, starting in verse 1, he says, "In the same way, you wives, be submissive to your own husbands, so that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives as they observe your chaste and respectful behavior." Don't pass by those two verses, because what he's saying there in those first two verses is even if you are a good example to your husband, even if you try to teach your non-believing husband, even if you try to convert them, sometimes they're not going to listen to you. But what they will listen to and what they will notice is your behavior, which just buttresses the point from 1 Timothy chapter 2 and even more. That it's not about what you wear, it's not about your gold, it's not about your pearls, it's not about any of our clothes, it's about our hidden person of the hearts. 1 Peter chapter 3, though, he's talking specifically to women, and he keeps on going here in verse 3 by saying your adornment must not be merely external, braiding the hair, wearing gold jewelry, putting on dresses, but let it be, verse 4, this phrase that we've been mentioning, let it be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. Gold, jewels, clothes, these things wear out. But what doesn't wear out is this quality of a gentle and a quiet spirit. And that's what God truly cares about. That's what God really focuses on. Verse 5, "For in this way in former times the holy women also, who hoped in God, used to adorn themselves, being submissive to their own husbands, just as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you have become her children if you do what is right, without being frightened by any fear." He doesn't describe in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and in 1 Peter chapter 3, he doesn't describe women who are cowardly, who cower over in the corner and just worship their husbands. And I don't know if that busts any husbands' bubbles here in this morning or not, but it doesn't describe women who just cower over in the corner and just willfully submit to every whim of their husbands. It describes women who have an indomitable spirit of righteousness, who let that pervade into every corner of their personality, who focus on God, who focus on hospitality, who focus on good examples, who focus on charity. You know, if you read Proverbs chapter 31, that story of the righteous and the virtuous woman, you don't find a woman who's cowering in the corner. You find a woman who is headstrong, someone who is submissive to her husband, but somebody who is active, somebody who is in the world trying to make it a better place. And that's probably the most cliche thing I'll say all day. But somebody who is out there trying to make the world better and trying to draw people closer to God. And when we adorn ourselves, and this applies to both men and women equally, when we adorn ourselves with clothes that we think, make us look good, and when we spend hours and hours upon our hair, which you may not know, I actually spent over 5 minutes on my hair this morning. But when that's what we focus on, that's what we fixate on, we give less time to the things that truly matter, which is righteousness, holiness, and our example among people in the world, and especially our devotion towards God. When the world shows off, because that's all they have to show off, modesty covers up and lets the most important thing take center stage. Second of all, when the world pressures you into sin, modesty stands firm. You can't help but notice the parallels with Vashti in Esther chapter 1 to what you see with Herodias in Mark the 6th chapter. There's a reason that this story about Herod and Herodias is mentioned in almost every gospel. I think every gospel except for John. And the primary reason, in my opinion, is because it tells the final story of John the Baptist, who was one of the most influential figures in Scripture. But in Mark the 6th chapter, starting in verse 21, you have the backstory leading up there in verse 14 down to verse 20, the backstory between Herod and John. Herod is not a big fan of John for a whole bunch of different reasons. Doesn't like what he's preaching, doesn't like what he's talking about, but he is scared of him. And if he's not scared of him, he's scared of the people who love him. But in verse 21, the very first word that's used, at least in my Bible in Mark chapter 6, it says, a strategic day came. That means there, especially if you look at that backstory from verses 14 through 20, is that Herod was probably looking for an opportunity to get rid of John the Baptist. And all of a sudden, verse 21, a strategic day came when Herod on his birthday gave a banquet for his lords and his military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. Does that sound similar to what we saw in Esther chapter 1? And when the daughter of Herodias herself came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his dinner guests. And the king said to the girl, ask for me whatever you want and I will give it to you. And he swore to her, whatever you ask of me, I will give it to you, up to half my kingdom. Now Herod Antipas is the one that's in view here, also known as Herod the Tetrarch. Herod the Tetrarch would be one who's responsible for a third of the kingdom of Judea. And so what he is offering Herodias in this situation is a sixth of the kingdom of Judea, which is not a big chunk of land, hand, but it's also not insignificant either. I think you have the party that's taking place to blame for why he's even offering that in the first place. And she went out, verse 24, and said to her mother, "What shall I ask for?" And she said, "The head of John the Baptist." Now, it seems odd if you're just reading Mark the 6th chapter kind of linearly and you get to this point, because you think to yourself, what does Herodias' mom, possibly Salome, what does Salome have against John the Baptist? And when you read the context in verses 14 through 20 going up to that point, you find out that John the Baptist had been speaking out publicly against this marriage, because Herod and Antipas had taken Herodias' mom Salome when probably they were visiting, when I think Herod Philip was out of town, and he divorced his wife, she divorced him, they got together, which by the way breaks every adultery law in the Old Testament, including the one that has to do with incest, and marries Salome in plain view of everybody. And John the Baptist was one of the only people to actually speak out against that. And everybody knows he's right. But very few people have the guts to actually do something about it. And John the Baptist is speaking publicly. He's proclaiming condemnation against Herod. He's proclaiming condemnation against Salome. He's still working. He's still busy. So that's why you have here in Mark the 6th chapter, verse 21, that it says the strategic day came. All of a sudden the conditions were right. The situation was perfect. The opportunity was there for them to finally be rid of John the Baptist. And in verse 25, she came in a hurry and said, "I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter." And although the king was very sorry, yet because of his oaths and because of his dinner guest, he was unwilling to refuse her. And immediately the king sent an executioner and commanded him to bring back his head. He went and had him beheaded on a prison, brought his head on a platter, gave it to the girl, and the girl gave it to her mother. And when his disciples heard about this, they came and took away his body and laid it in a tomb. What a horrible set of circumstances. And yet you can't help but notice that both this story here in Mark the 6th chapter and the one in Esther chapter 1, both of them ended very tragically. In this situation, John the Baptist being executed. Esther chapter 1, it ended up with Vashti being deposed from her throne. Both of those began with a sultry dance. Which, by the way, the dance, we didn't even cover this, the dance that's mentioned there in Esther chapter 1 is probably an early form of Greek paganism, type of lascivious dance. So it's not as if she's just there kind of being a sideshow. There's a very clear intent happening there. A very similar dance to what's happening here in Mark the 6th chapter. The lust is there. The embarrassment is there. The sin is there. And both of these occasions, the people were pressured into sin. In both occasions, sin or bad things resulted as a result of people's drunkenness and as a result of their sin. When the world pressures you into sin, modesty stands firm. And this is where the bigger discussion around modesty takes place. There are people in the world today that will make the argument that you should never wear a bathing suit. There are people today that make the argument that you should never go to prom. And my point there is not to wade into those arguments, because I know as soon as I do, I'm going to have half the people leave without looking at me, and have the other people give me a high five on the way out. My point is not to wade into those issues. My point here is that in whatever situation you find yourself in whatever environment you're in, modesty needs to take place. That mentality towards modesty needs to be the primary driving force. Because if not, then it doesn't matter if you are in a swimsuit or you're not in a swimsuit. It doesn't matter if you're at the prom or you're not at the prom. There are going to be many more opportunities for immodest type of activities to take place. But developing, as he talks about in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and 1 Peter chapter 3, that hidden person of the heart, if that's developed, then the other issues will take care of themselves. I think if that issue is taken care of, then the issue of whether or not to wear a bathing suit will really not come into play. The question of what after party to go to after prom will not come into play. Because that hidden person of the heart is what's being developed, and not situational ethics that we kind of decide what we want to do in the moment. We decide long before how we're going to react to that situation. It's the mentality that says my body is not for anybody else. And whether Vashti was making that argument when she refused to come and dance before Ahasuerus or not, whether that was her situation or she was saying, I'm not going to degrade myself to this point, whatever the situation was, she did not allow herself to be degraded in front of anybody else. And bravo to her. Modest heart is the one that says, my body is my spouse's. It's not even mine. If you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and 7. My body belongs to my spouse. That's not a gift that I can freely give away. When the world pressures you into sin, modesty, stand firm. And it should come as no shocker to anybody that people are going to hate us for that. When the world rejects you, modesty stays confident. I want you to look back at 1 Peter chapter 4. We read 1 Peter chapter 3 and talked about the hidden person of the heart. I want you to look at 1 Peter chapter 4 because 1 Peter is not a treatise on modesty. It's not a discussion about what you should wear and what you should not wear. But in 1 Peter chapter 4, Peter picks up on this theme that he's been going at the entire book, which is about persecution. 1 Peter is all about persecution. And in 1 Peter chapter 4, starting verse 1, he talks about this issue, and I think in view of what he had said, in large part, in what he said in the beginning of 1 Peter chapter 3. In 1 Peter chapter 4, starting in verse 1, he says, "Therefore, since Christ has suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same purpose, because he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live the rest of the time in the flesh no longer for the lusts of men, but for the will of God. For the time already past," verse 3, "is sufficient for you to have carried out the desire of the Gentiles, having pursued a course of sensuality, lust, drunkenness, carousing, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries." Did you hear what he said there? He says in 1 Peter chapter 4, those first 4 verses, that the time is past for you to engage in those sins. And I would ask you to think about that situation critically. It's not as if Peter in this situation is just trying to say, don't do that anymore. I think he's making largely the same argument that Joshua does in Joshua chapter 4. You know, look at the gods of the Amorites on the other side of the river. Look at the gods of the Canaanites. Look at the gods of the pagans that are around you and see for yourself if that's what you want to do. If that's the life you want to live, if those are the gods you want to serve. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And what he says here in 1 Peter chapter 4, I would argue is something very similar when he says, sin and the time for sin has ceased. It's in the past. It's no longer. It's not any good anymore. Verse 3, it's already sufficient for you to have carried out the desire of the Gentiles. You saw where that life got you. And it got you away from God. The lust-filled activities of pagan rituals, the lustful drunkenness of the parties that ended in nothing except heartache. The time already past is sufficient for you to have carried out those things. Verse 4, and yet in all this, they're surprised that you do not run with them in the same excesses of dissipation, and they malign you. Notice the irony of this statement. The people who spend their life in these parties, the people who spend their life chasing the desires of the flesh, and yet wake up the next morning feeling more empty than they did the day before. And then they have the gall to turn around and tell you that you're a fool for not doing that. I'll never forget the day after, I hadn't been in college very long at SFA, when somebody who was clearly hungover and had just vomited in the hallway outside my dorm told me, and I quote, "I missed a fantastic party the night before." I had Pizza Hut and played video games with a couple of friends the night before in my dorm. That was fantastic to me. But I thought, what did I miss? I see what I missed right here. And I can see what I missed kind of wobbling in front of me. It doesn't look like I missed anything. And so that's the irony of this statement in 1 Peter chapter 4 when he says they're surprised that you don't run with them. But verse 5, they will give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For the gospel has for this purpose been preached even to those who are dead, that though they are judged in the flesh as men, they may live in the spirit according to the will of God. We talked about in the Bible class this morning, for those of you who are on our 8 o'clock class, we talked about this morning, and we'll pick up with it again as we talk about in Psalm 119 and next Sunday morning's class, but that the law of God gives freedom. It gives us liberty. And that's almost paradoxical to what we think about when we think about the law, that a life lived in obedience to God gives us freedom. What it gives us freedom to is sin and the lust of the flesh. And what it gives us ultimately is a freedom to follow God with our whole hearts. That is what should make us confident. If the world rejects you, Jesus said, know that it rejected me beforehand. If it rejects you, know that it rejected me. When the world rejects us for our stance, modesty stays confident. There's no way to know whether or not Vashti knew what eventually would result from the situation with Esther. It probably doesn't really matter even if she did know. But when Vashti made the decision to stand up to Ahasuerus and refuse to allow herself to be a sideshow to a bunch of drunken men, that deposement that was probably world-shattering for her and for her family paved the way for Esther to rise to a position of prominence and save the people of Israel. We don't know what the outcome of our decisions is going to be tomorrow for the decisions that we made today. And yet we know that if we do God's will and we stay obedient to Him, we can be confident that whatever happens is in the best interest of the kingdom, is in the best interest of our soul. You may be sitting here unsure about whether or not you want to make the decision to follow Christ. Or maybe you're knee-deep in sin for whatever reason and thinking to yourself, there's no way I can get out of this. There's no way that I can put my best foot forward. There's no way that God will forgive me. And I'm here to tell you that God did not come to save the healthy. He came to save the sick. And all of us, Romans chapter 3 and verse 23, are sick to a certain extent. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. All of us need God's forgiveness. And so you're no different than the rest of us. All of us need that saving grace of Christ. And I would encourage you to grab hold of it with both hands as we stand and as we sing.